Senator Reynolds.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. I too rise to speak in support of this motion, and I also welcome the Sikyong and the Tibetan delegation here today, so thank you. Human freedoms are universal and must always be fought for, both here and overseas. Today, these freedoms are under threat globally, and nowhere more so than in Tibet. The Coalition remains deeply concerned about the detention of Tibetans for the peaceful expression of political views, for restrictions on travel, and China's sinicizing policies on Tibetan cultural rights, religion and heritage. Today I address increasing global concerns about severe violations of religious freedom in Tibet and the deliberate sinicizing of Tibetan culture and religion, in other words, cultural genocide. Australians will be shocked to hear that the Chinese government is forcing Tibetan children into boarding schools. In fact, it is now believed that up to 80% of Tibetan children between the ages of 6 and 18 have been systematically separated from their families and sent to what the UN called colonial-style boarding schools with little or no access to their parents. Earlier this year, UN experts expressed alarm at this practice, which they referred to as what appears to be a policy of forced assimilation of Tibetan identity through a series of oppressive actions against Tibetan education, religious and linguistic institutions. These UN experts reported their report describes these schools as colonial in design and practice, serving the CCP's goal of sinicizing Tibetans through immersion in Mandarin Chinese instruction and a highly politicised curriculum. The UN experts have also highlighted the coercive nature of these schools. And shockingly, Tibetan parents are often faced with no choice but to send their children to these residential schools because of school closures and consolidation, in some cases accompanied by fines or threats of non-compliance. This is clearly a fundamental violation of the rights of Tibetan parents and children by interfering with their right to preserve the integrity of their own family units and stripping them of their right to choose the education, the language and the cultural features of their children. The Chinese authorities appear to be pursuing a large-scale action to literally assimilate Tibetan culture and language. As I said, cultural genocide. Assimilation by the state education system that forces children to be enrolled in Putonghua language in government schools that do not provide for a substantive study, or if any at all, of Tibetan history and culture. Enrolment in these residential schools is often made, as I've said, under pressure. And in some cases, Tibetan parents and children are left without a choice. And many parents, it is reported now, barely see their children, if at all. As a result, Tibetan children are increasingly losing their native language and the ability to communicate easily and readily with their grandparents and now, in many cases, with their own parents. They have become extremely vulnerable living in these very large residential homes, and they are losing their connectivity with their history, their culture and, indeed, their very Tibetan identity. And these residential schooling is forcing the separation from their families, and of course, with children of any age, you'd imagine, and it is producing deep and serious negative psychological and social impacts on these children who have literally been ripped away from their families. And as I said, reports coming out now that it's about 80%. If you think of that, 8 in 10 Tibetan children have been removed from their families permanently. And you can imagine that loss of family connections results in apathy, anxiety, interaction disorders, feelings of loneliness, isolation, alienation, terrible homesickness, and pretty much any other form of physical or emotional distress that you could imagine. And all of that has been done deliberately to actually make sure that these children grow up not as Tibetans but as Han Chinese. The UN and the USA have both acted on this issue of cultural genocide in Tibet, and I now call on the Australian government to do the same, and also, like the United States has done, to consider Magnitsky sanctions against Chinese officials responsible for heinous and gross abuse of Tibetans. Colleagues, the time for us to act is now. The fight for individual liberties and freedoms is enduring. wherever they occur, here or anywhere else in the world. And so I support this motion.
Your time has expired. Senator O'Neill.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. And